The wind had started pushing against the windows by late afternoon. You could hear it in the lobby glass, low, steady, and mean, like it was trying to find a way in. I was refilling the coffee urn near the front desk when I saw the headlights approach. Slow, careful, a dark car barely visible through the falling snow, no chains on the tires, no license plate on the front. When it finally parked, no one got out for a long time. Just sat there in the driver's seat, engine running like he was still deciding something. When he came in, he didn't speak, just slid a credit card across the desk and watched me process the check-in. I asked if he wanted help with bags. He didn't answer, but I remember his shoes wet but spotless. Let me know where you're listening from tonight, and if you've ever had a guest or a neighbor who just didn't quite fit. And if stories like this help you fall asleep, feel free to subscribe so you won't miss the next one. My name's Dana Ellis. I was 37 when this happened, working the evening shift at Pine Bend Lodge up near Monarch Pass in Colorado. That was back in 2006. I'd moved out there from Grand Junction after the divorce, just needed quiet, honestly. Something slower. The lodge was built in the 60s, mostly cedar and river stone, with 12 rooms that faced the tree line. I liked the job, especially off-season. Fewer guests meant fewer problems. That night in January, we only had 3 rooms booked. A retired couple from Flagstaff on the 2nd floor, and a snowboarding instructor from Utah down near the corner. I'd already checked them all in by 6:30. It was just me and Len Turner, after that our night maintenance guy. He usually showed up around 7, fixed whatever was broken, then sat in the back room reading old hunting magazines until midnight. We didn't talk much, but I liked him. Steady, quiet. It was almost dusk when the man came in. No reservation. Just that dark car and a stare I still remember almost 20 years later. He wore a black wool coat and a scarf tucked tight up under his chin. His hair was short and damp from the storm. I remember the smell that came in with him, cold air, and something else, something faint, like singed wires or battery acid. Not strong enough to say anything, just wrong enough that I noticed. I asked how many nights he'd be staying. He didn't answer right away, just took the pen from the counter and slowly filled out the check-in slip. His handwriting was perfectly neat, slanted like he'd been taught to write a certain way and never unlearned it. When I slid the room key toward him, I asked if he needed help carrying anything in. He shook his head once. That's all. Room 8, ground floor. Far end of the hallway, the quietest room in the lodge. About an hour later, Len came through the lobby to check a heating unit in one of the upstairs rooms. I mentioned the late guest and how strange it had been, but he just nodded and said, "You get folks like that up here sometimes. Cold makes people weird." Then he disappeared into the stairwell. I figured that was the end of it, but around 9:30 I noticed something. The door to room 8 was cracked open. Not wide, not obvious, just enough that I could see the light was off. I wouldn't have thought anything of it. Maybe he was getting ice or just airing the room, but I never heard footsteps. And it was 10 degrees outside with wind pushing against the walls. Who'd leave a door open in that? Still, I didn't want to be nosy. I waited another 20 minutes before doing a soft walk-through. That's what we called it, just making sure everything was secure before the front desk closed at 11. I passed room 8 again, and the door was still ajar. No sound, no movement. I leaned in a little, didn't knock, just called out, "Sir." Everything all right in there? Nothing. I waited another beat, then gently pushed the door open farther. The curtains were drawn and the heat was on. Room looked tidy, bed untouched. But the chair in the corner was turned slightly toward the window like someone had been sitting there, watching. There was a suitcase on the luggage stand, closed. I stepped back out and shut the door, figuring maybe he'd gone to his car or was using the back exit. But when I checked the lot, the car was still there. Engine off, no footprints in the snow, none leading away, none coming back. That's when I felt it. Not fear, not yet, just that quiet tension you get when something doesn't match. The hallway was too still, not peaceful, still. The way a room feels when you walk into it and know someone's just been there, even if you can't see them. At 10:45, I locked the front desk and radioed Len. Asked if he'd seen the guy from room 8. Len said no. He'd just finished checking the water heater and hadn't seen anyone move since dinner. I told him I had a weird feeling. Len didn't laugh or blow it off, just said, "All right, I'll take a walk down there." I waited near the lobby lights, low, watching the snow come down through the tall windows. It was coming faster now, building up on the railing outside. Len came back after a few minutes, said the door was closed now, said the lights were off. No answer when he knocked, but he didn't think anyone was inside. Still, we didn't open the room. That's policy, unless there's a reason. At midnight, I signed out and handed the shift to Len. As I was leaving, he asked again if I'd seen the guy come back from outside. I told him no. I hadn't seen anyone walk past the lobby, and there were no prints in the snow. He just nodded and said, "Well, let's see if he's still here in the morning." But he wasn't. The next day, room 8 was empty. Bed untouched. Key left on the table. Suitcase gone. No checkout. No sign of departure. Just gone. The car still parked in the same spot, frosted over. No one ever came back to claim it. I still think about that man. No name, no voice, just the smell of battery acid. And a chair turned toward a window that faced nothing but trees. I don't usually talk about that job, not because anything horrible happened to me, nothing you could prove anyway, but because I still can't explain what I saw. And when people don't get something, they tend to look at you like maybe you've just been alone too long. Maybe I had been. Back in 2011, I was 22, taking general courses at the University of Alaska, Fairbanks, and trying to save enough for the next semester. I picked up a part-time overnight shift at a fuel stop on the highway east of Tok, the kind of place that only existed to keep long-haul truckers from running dry in the middle of nowhere. It had one dusty diesel pump, one regular, and a small prefab building where we sold instant coffee, microwave burritos, and those stiff little maps nobody used anymore. The station sat just off mile 237, nothing but trees and tundra in every direction. We were the only lit structure for 20 miles in either direction. No traffic lights, no signs of civilization. Just a flickering canopy light and the blue hum of bug zappers in summer, or in the winter that low howl of wind brushing against the siding like fingertips. I worked 3 nights a week, Wednesdays, Fridays, and Sundays, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. It was dull work, and I liked it that way. I brought textbooks, headphones, and sometimes a portable DVD player if I was really desperate. The security camera didn't work half the time, and we weren't allowed to lock the doors. My boss said if someone wanted to rob the place, we were told to stand back and let them. But none of that is why I'm telling you this. It started one Wednesday in February. Snow was coming down hard. Real thick, dry flakes, the kind that look like ashes falling sideways when headlights cut through them. I was on the late shift, alone, watching reruns of some cooking show on mute, when I heard the crunch of tires. A truck pulled in. Not a semi-something older. Mid-size. The lights stayed on a little too long before cutting out. I stood behind the counter waiting for someone to come in, but they didn't. I peeked out the front window and saw a blue Chevy pickup parked by Pump 4. Late 80s model squared frame chrome bumper dulled by rust. There was a figure in the driver's seat, not moving, no dome light, no window rolled down, just sitting there in the dark. I waited maybe 2 minutes, then keyed the mic on the old intercom system. "Pump's ready to go," I said. No response, no movement. Another minute passed. I stepped outside and walked to the edge of the awning. The snow hit my neck like a slap, cold, sharp, steady. The windows of the truck were tinted not too dark, but enough that I couldn't see the driver's face clearly. Just a faint silhouette. Looked like he was sitting up straight, maybe too straight. I raised my hand. Nothing. I walked back inside. Didn't love the feeling in my chest, that weird static that buzzes in your gut when something's not wrong exactly, but it isn't right either. Eventually, the truck backed up, slowly turned around without getting gas, and drove off the same way it came. No tire squeal, no hurry, just a slow roll into the snow and gone. I didn't think much of it until the next Wednesday. Same time, same kind of snow, same truck. Pulled into Pump 4 lights on longer than necessary. No one got out, just sat there. I didn't go outside that time. I watched from behind the counter the blue paint of the pickup glowing faintly under the canopy. Again, no movement. Again, after a while, it backed away and vanished down the road. It kept happening, every Wednesday night as long as it was snowing. Always Pump 4. Always the same truck, I told my boss. He laughed and said it was probably some weirdo trying to freak me out. Said he'd get the camera fixed. But it never got fixed. The footage glitched or didn't save. And after a while, I stopped trying to explain. One night, I brought a flashlight out with me and shined it straight into the cab. That's when I saw him. The driver. A man in his 60s, maybe older. Face pale slack. Not sleeping, just still, like he was frozen in place. His hands were on the steering wheel but didn't grip it, just rested there. His mouth was slightly open, eyes wide, like he was looking at something far away, or like he wasn't seeing anything at all. I waved my flashlight. Nothing. The snow was starting to come down heavier, so I backed up and went inside. I didn't go out again that night. Later, I asked one of the day shift guys about it. Older guy named Frank, who'd worked there for decades. I described the truck, the driver. Frank got real quiet. Then he told me about Walter Hicks. Said Walter used to drive a truck like that back in the early 90s. A miner who came through once a week on his way back from a claim near Eagle. Always paid in cash, always Pump 4. Until one night during a bad storm, he vanished on the road between here and Chicken. They never found his truck. No wreckage, no body, just gone. The last time anyone saw him, he'd fueled up and said storm's gonna bury everything tonight. Frank said some folks believed the road took him, said the snow could hold things the way water does, slow, heavy, and permanent. I didn't believe it, not really, but I started keeping a log in the back office. Every time the truck came, I noted the date, time, weather. Always Wednesdays, always during snow. One night, the truck didn't just sit there. It moved. It pulled up to pump 4 and sat for 5 minutes like usual. Then it backed up a few feet, turned toward the side of the building, and idled there, closer to the windows, facing the office. I couldn't see the driver this time. The glare on the windshield made it impossible. But I heard something. Static. Not from outside, from the back room. The old portable radio we kept for emergencies had turned on by itself. Just crackling. No station, just pure static. I unplugged it. Still crackled. The sound didn't stop until the truck drove away. The final time I saw it, I did something I shouldn't have. I stepped outside, stood in the middle of the parking lot while it idled. It was colder than usual, bitter and dry, the kind of cold that bites your fingertips through gloves. I walked up to the driver's side, not too close. I just wanted to see him clearly again. But the cab was empty, I swear to you. The headlights were on, engine running, but there was no one inside, not even a shadow. I blinked hard, backed up, and that's when the passenger door creaked open about 2 inches. No one stepped out. Nothing happened. Just that little movement like an invitation. I ran. I quit the following week, said I was falling behind in school, which was true, but not the real reason. A few years later, I passed through that stretch again. Station had been shut down after a fire. The lot was overgrown, canopy collapsed. Pump 4 was still there, rusted and half sunk into frost. I walked out and stood where the truck used to sit. The air was quiet, too quiet. And when I turned to leave, I noticed something carved into the pump's metal casing. It was faint, barely visible, like it had been scratched with a key or a coin. Just a name. Walter H. And beneath it, the numbers 20 AM. I looked down and saw my breath freeze in the air. It was Wednesday, and the snow had just started to fall. Back in 2017, I took a week off work and flew up to Alaska to go hunting with my dad. He was 63 then and slowing down a bit, but still sharp-eyed and steady on his feet. We'd done trips like that before, when I was a kid mostly, for moose or elk, but it had been nearly a decade since the last one. I guess we both knew time wasn't on our side anymore. So when he asked if I'd come with him to one of his old spots along the Copper River Basin, I didn't hesitate. The cabin we stayed in wasn't much to look at. A flat-roofed A-frame tucked into the tree line, weathered to a silvery gray, with no insulation worth mentioning. It was something one of his old buddies had built back in the 80s, just a bunk, a stove, and a locked crate, with bear spray, ammo, and coffee tins. You had to bring your own fuel and sleep in your clothes to stay warm at night. We parked the truck on a gravel pull-off 4 miles away and hiked the rest in. The snow had already started to crust over in places, but the sky was clear, and the cold felt honest. The first day out we saw tracks, lots of them, but no movement. I'm used to that. It's common for the animals to go quiet when someone new shows up. But even so, something felt strange. There were no birds, no rabbits, no rustle of underbrush. The woods had this hollow, padded stillness that reminded me of walking through a house where someone had just moved out. The quiet didn't feel natural. On the second day, we found a carcass, a caribou cleanly gutted. At first, I thought it was the work of another hunter, but there were no bullet holes, no drag marks, and the skin around the chest had been pulled open with a precision I didn't like. It looked surgical. My dad crouched beside it and ran a gloved hand over the ribs. He didn't say anything, just gave a quiet grunt and stood up. That night, he cleaned his rifle twice and left the lantern burning low while we slept. On the third day, we split up to scout opposite ridges. I wasn't more than a half-mile from the cabin, moving slow and careful when I caught a glimpse of something through the trees. Large, black, fast. It moved uphill, then vanished behind a line of spruce. I called out, thinking it might have been my dad, but got no response. When I circled around the ridge to find where it had gone, I came across another kill. This time, it was a snowshoe hare. Same clean removal of the insides, but the strangest part was the arrangement. Its body was laid out in the center of a shallow, snow-packed circle, like something had deliberately cleared the space first. The fur had been peeled back from the paws like gloves. I started heading back right after that. The light was going, and I didn't want to be caught out there in the dark. I found my dad already at the cabin boiling coffee and saying nothing. When I told him what I'd seen, he just nodded once and said, "You sleep with the rifle tonight." I asked him if there were wolves in the area, and he said sure, but this wasn't wolf sign, not like any he knew. He'd hunted those hills for 40 years. Whatever it was, it didn't behave like a predator. It acted like it was setting traps. The fourth day, the wind shifted. A storm was coming, but he wanted to do one more loop out east. Said it might push the moose down closer to the river. We left together, but split again once we hit the ridge. I followed the slope toward a narrow clearing he remembered from past hunts. When I got there, I froze. Lined up along the edge of the clearing were bones. Small ones at first, rabbits, foxes maybe, but then larger. A set of moose ribs, cracked and polished clean. A deer spine curled into a tight coil like it had died afraid. All of it arranged in loose, careful arcs, not in piles. And standing at the center of the clearing, facing away from me, was a black figure. It was still, upright. At first, I thought it was a man in a heavy coat, but then it dropped to all fours in one fluid motion and moved into the trees without a sound. I didn't chase it. I couldn't have. My knees locked, and it took everything I had to keep from running. I backed away slow and steady until I reached the edge of the ridge. From there, I fired one shot into the air, not to hit anything, just to let my dad know where I was. He found me an hour later, pale and quiet. We didn't talk on the way back. That night, we both stayed up. The fire snapped and popped, but outside the walls of the cabin it was silent. No wind, no snow, just that thick, padded hush again. At some point after midnight, I heard movement outside. Not walking exactly, more like pacing, back and forth. I nudged my dad, and he nodded. He'd heard it too. We sat like that for hours, listening to the slow crunch of snow outside. It would circle the cabin, pause, and start again. But it never touched the door. When morning came, we stepped outside together. There were tracks all around the cabin, huge prints, not like boots or paws, more like elongated depressions spaced far apart as if the thing had been moving with purpose. The snow inside the prints hadn't melted, just packed tight. At the back of the cabin, we found a small pile of pebbles perfectly stacked. 3 stones high, balanced just outside the reach of the roof's drip line. That was the last day of the trip. We hiked back in silence. My dad didn't say much on the drive home. Later, he admitted that it wasn't the first time he'd felt something watching out there. Said he used to get the same feeling every so often in his younger days, but nothing ever happened until now. He never went back after that. Neither did I. Sometimes I think about that pile of stones, the way it was placed so neatly, like a marker or a warning. And the worst part is, when I got home and unpacked my gear, I found another pebble, small, flat, and smooth, tucked into the heel of my boot. I started that field season feeling pretty good about things. The grant came through early, the gear arrived on time for once, and Dr. Ortega, our lead biologist, was in one of her rare good moods. We were based just a few miles south of the Yukon border, part of a wildlife research team studying caribou migration across the taiga. Our goal that spring was to collect GPS data from a herd we'd been following for 3 years. 43 animals, each fitted with a collar transmitting position every 4 hours. Reliable data until the morning it all just stopped. We were in the main trailer when it happened. Gray sky outside coffee pot, already burned through its second batch. One by one, the signals disappeared from the monitor. Not scattered, not fading, just gone. Jamie leaned over the screen, tapping at the keys, muttering to herself. I remember her saying, "That's not normal. They wouldn't all fail at once." I looked out the narrow window and felt the cold press of the wind off the valley. Something about that moment made the back of my neck itch. We figured it was a technical glitch at first, satellite dropout collar battery failure, something boring. But Mark, our field tech, pointed out that the signals all stopped within the same 4-hour window. That wasn't boring. That was deliberate or coordinated, and neither possibility sat well with any of us. 2 days later, we flew the drone over the area where the last pings had come through. Sparse tree cover, low scrub, a frozen river curling through the lowlands like a crack in the world. The thermal camera was picking up little foxes, a bear wandering half a mile from our zone. But then near the riverbank, we saw them. 7 figures moving in slow, perfectly synchronized steps across the snow. Not animals, not heat ghosts. Human-shaped, human-sized. But the cadence of their motion wasn't right. It looked mechanical, but not stiff, like someone mimicking the idea of walking without ever having done it. Jamie didn't say anything at first. She just leaned in, rewound the footage, watched it again. Then she reached over and switched off the thermal overlay. When we tried to locate the same figures visually, just shapes, outlines, anything, they weren't there. Not in the daylight footage, not in the high-res stills. It was like they only existed in temperature. The next morning, Mark didn't come in for breakfast. He was staying in one of the smaller tents near the tree line. We figured he was just sleeping off the cold, but by noon, when he still hadn't answered the radio, Jamie told me to check on him. His tent was unzipped, the flap barely moving in the wind. His gear was untouched. His boots were lined up neatly at the edge of the canvas. There were no tracks, no drag marks, just the boots empty, pointing toward the frozen ridge like he'd stepped out of them and walked away barefoot in 30 degrees. We called it in, of course, but calling for help in a place like that doesn't do much good. The Rangers put a helicopter in the air by late afternoon, but we knew they wouldn't find him. There was nothing to find. The snow held no prints. The radio picked up no signal. I remember the sound of the rotor blades thumping overhead as I stood in the exact spot where his boots had been looking out over a field of white that refused to give back any answers. A few days passed. We packed up early, cut the mission short. Jamie filed a formal report, but it read like every other one I've ever seen from up there. Environmental disorientation, possible wildlife encounter, presumed fatal exposure. It didn't say what I saw on the final drone sweep. I haven't told anyone that part until now. Right before we powered the drone down, I set it to run one last perimeter scan. Same coordinates, same altitude. I don't know why I watched the footage that night. It was late. I was tired. My hands still shaking a little from the cold, but I queued it up anyway. The footage came in shaky at first, crosswinds tugging the drone cloud cover thickening. Then, just before it passed over the ridge where Mark's boots were found, the camera caught something. A shallow depression in the snow, a hole maybe 2 feet across. At the bottom, barely visible, was one of our GPS collars, still intact, still blinking, buried. Jamie didn't believe me when I showed her the clip. She said it was a reflection, an error in the thermal layer. She shut the laptop and went to bed without another word. I didn't argue, because here's the part I haven't said aloud. That night, lying in my bunk, I kept thinking about those synchronized figures, the way they moved in silence, the way they stayed in formation, never looking up. I kept picturing them circling that spot in the snow over and over, like they were rehearsing something. And just before I finally drifted off to sleep, I remembered something Mark said a few days earlier, before everything went strange. We were walking the southern ridge, talking about nothing in particular, when he paused and said, "You ever get the feeling something's watching, just to see if we notice it?" I had laughed at the time, but now I don't think he was joking. I still do remote work now and then, but never that far north. Never where the GPS goes quiet and the snow won't hold a footprint. I still think about those 7 heat signatures, where they came from, where they went, and if maybe, just maybe, one of them was waiting for someone to fall out of step. I took the job at the lodge mostly to get away from things. It was seasonal work, cleaning cabins, doing laundry, refilling wood stacks, and the pay wasn't great, but the isolation felt like a relief. No cell reception, no social obligations, just pine trees and quiet. The place was halfway up a mountain in northern Idaho, surrounded by thick woods and barely marked roads. Most guests came for hunting or solitude. A few brought wine and expectations and left disappointed. The ones who stayed longer tended to keep to themselves. Troy showed up with 2 others, David and Amanda. They were in their 30s, maybe older, and something about the dynamic between them didn't sit right. Amanda talked too fast and smiled too much. David never smiled at all. Troy was the one who checked them in. He seemed easygoing, friendly, the type who called you boss even if you were folding sheets. They were staying in one of the bigger cabins, cabin 4, the one with the old stone fireplace and the creaky deck. For the first 2 days, I saw them around the lodge occasionally. They didn't ask for much, just extra towels, a wine key, directions to the nearest trail. David was the only one who seemed agitated. He kept rubbing his wrist like something was under his skin. Amanda told me it was a nervous habit, and when I asked if everything was okay, she laughed like it was a stupid question. On the third morning, I noticed their car was still parked where it had been the night before. That wasn't unusual in itself, but the frost on the windshield hadn't been disturbed. In weather like that, even walking past a car warmed the glass a little. It was a small thing, but it stayed in my head. Later that day, David came into the front office and asked for ice. I told him the machine was out, it usually was, and offered him a bag from the kitchen freezer. He looked disappointed, or maybe just tired. Then he said something that caught me off guard. Troy won't be coming back down for dinner. He's feeling sick. Just leave a tray on the porch. I nodded, but something about the way he said it felt rehearsed. I saw Amanda that night, too. She came into the lodge alone, sat by the fire for almost an hour, not reading or talking, just staring at the flames like she was waiting for someone to speak first. The next morning, the food tray I'd left on their porch was untouched. Still covered, still warm inside the cloche. That was the first time I knocked. No answer. I knocked again, called out Troy's name. Amanda opened the door halfway and said he was sleeping off a migraine. Her tone was pleasant, but her eyes were tight. I left without pushing it. That night a storm rolled in wet snow, strong winds, power flickering. I did my usual check of the cabins before bed. When I passed cabin 4, I noticed the porch light was off. Every other cabin had theirs on. Guests liked to keep them lit for safety, and even if they didn't, we always left them on by default. But this one was dark, the snow on the steps undisturbed. The next morning, I couldn't find David or Amanda anywhere. Their car was gone. The cabin door was unlocked, which was unusual. When I stepped inside, the smell hit me first. Damp wood, stale air, something metallic underneath. There was no sign of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no blood. But the energy was wrong still, like the room hadn't breathed in days. In the corner under a pile of folded blankets, I saw Troy's boots. Not near the bed, not by the fire, just tucked away like someone wanted them hidden. I told my supervisor and we called the sheriff. They sent someone up, took statements, asked for guest records. Amanda and David had paid cash. No license plate was recorded, no emergency contact, no credit card on file. They'd vanished. The sheriff brought dogs a few days later. The dogs circled the cabin, sniffed the woods, then lost the trail near the creek bed behind the lodge. That was in late October. We didn't find Troy until the snow melted. He was discovered half buried behind the bathhouse, which we kept closed in the winter. One of the pipes had burst, and when maintenance went in to check it, they found the wall panel loose. Behind it, in a crawl space, was Troy. He was still wearing his jacket. His eyes were open. There were marks on his wrists, thin, deliberate like wire or rope had been wrapped too tightly and then removed. The cause of death was blood loss from shallow wounds to the abdomen. Defensive wounds, they said. They ruled it an assault, but no one ever found David or Amanda. We gave the sheriff everything, logs, receipts, surveillance footage, but the cameras near the bathhouse had gone down during the storm. One of the deputies told me it looked like someone had pulled the cables on purpose. What still bothers me, though, is the thing no one could explain. On the inside wall of the crawl space, just above where Troy had been lying, there were faint scratch marks. Not random ones. They formed a shape, 4 lines, then 3, 4 again, then 1. I asked around. Maintenance said they hadn't seen them before. The sheriff didn't comment, but those lines, they looked like tally marks, like someone keeping count. I've thought about it a lot. The total was 12. There were only 3 guests that week, and I still wonder if Troy wasn't the first or the last. Back in 2019, I was hauling aluminum parts through western Nebraska, trying to beat a storm that had been crawling across the plains all week. I took Route 385 to shave off time. Not a route I used often, but I remembered it being quiet and direct. The kind of road where you could go 30 minutes without seeing another set of headlights. It was mid-November, just past 2 a.m., and the kind of cold that made your teeth ache when you stepped outside. Wind was slicing down out of the hills, and the highway was so empty it started to feel like a tunnel carved through nothing. I just passed through a little town called Whitney when I saw the figure. A woman, young, maybe early 20s, walking along the shoulder in a white hoodie with her arms wrapped tight around her chest. She didn't look like she was hitchhiking. No thumb out, no glance toward my cab, just trudging forward with her head down and hair blowing across her face. Something about how thin she looked against the wind bothered me. There was nothing out there, no towns for miles. No motels open, and the kind of weather that could turn deadly if you weren't dressed for it. I slowed down and called it in over the CB, then again to dispatch on my hands-free. I didn't stop right away. I figured someone else would catch her. But 3 miles later, guilt got the better of me, and I turned the rig around at a county road turnout. I expected she'd be long gone by the time I got back, but she wasn't. She was still walking, same pace, same direction, same arm-clutching shuffle, like she didn't notice the cold. I pulled over and rolled down the window. I kept it casual, asked if she needed help, offered a ride to the next town. She stopped walking but didn't look at me. Just stood still on the gravel shoulder like she was thinking. I asked again. She raised one hand, slowly, like she might wave me off. But then she said quietly, "I already tried." That stopped me cold. I asked what she meant. She said nothing else, just turned and started walking again, not running, just walking. I didn't follow. I called Highway Patrol and gave them my location. 10 minutes later, a cruiser pulled up behind me, and the officer name was Troy. I think walked over with his flashlight already in hand. I told him everything. He listened, asked the usual questions, nodded, then walked ahead to check the area where I'd last seen her. But she wasn't there. No footprints either. The wind was strong, sure, but it hadn't snowed in hours, and the road shoulder was dry dirt and frost. Her prints should have lingered. Troy came back and said I wasn't the first to report a girl like that. Said he'd heard the same description 3 times that winter. Same stretch of road, same time of night. Always walking north, always in white. He looked tired when he said it, not amused, not skeptical, just used to it. I asked if anyone had found her. He said no. Then he paused a second too long and added, "She's not someone we're looking for anymore." I pressed him on that gently. He shook his head. Said years ago, maybe 7 or 8, a young woman had gone missing out there. Left a bad relationship in Alliance and was trying to walk to her sister's in South Dakota. She'd texted someone that she was near Whitney, then never showed. Her body was found weeks later, frozen in a dry creek bed off a service road. Nobody was charged. No signs of foul play, just frostbite and exposure. The next part is what still keeps me up some nights. After Troy left, I sat in the cab for a while before turning around to keep going north. But as I pulled back onto the highway, my headlights caught something about a quarter-mile ahead, just a flash of white between the fences. I thought it might be her again. I slowed down. There was no shoulder at that stretch, just barbed wire and sagebrush. And then I saw it. A hoodie, caught on the fence, blowing in the wind. I pulled over again and walked up to it. The fabric was stiff, half torn, caught high on the wire, like someone had climbed through and it snagged. I didn't touch it. Something about how clean it looked didn't make sense. No dirt, no weather staining. It looked like it had just been put there, laid out, positioned. Back in the truck, I called dispatch and asked if the patrol unit had found anything. They said Officer Troy had clocked out 2 hours ago, wasn't assigned to this sector that night. I asked if another cruiser had been sent in his place. They checked. No record of a unit dispatched to 385. No Troy listed on the night shift roster. I asked if maybe he was filling in or off duty and responding nearby. The woman on the radio went quiet for a second, then asked me to hold. A different voice came on the line. Male comm, maybe a supervisor. He asked for my name and DOT number, confirmed my route and location. Then he said something that's stuck with me ever since. You're not the first to report him either. I finished the drive in silence. No music, no CB chatter. Just the low hum of the tires and the endless dark road. I never saw the girl again, never saw the officer either. But sometimes when I take that route, because I still do from time to time, I think about her. Walking alone in the cold. Head down, arms wrapped tight, always north. And somewhere behind her, maybe just out of reach. A cruiser following slowly, lights off. I don't usually talk about this, mostly because the people I've tried to tell just shake their heads like I must have been overtired or seeing things. And maybe I was. But I wasn't asleep. I know what I saw. It happened in 2016, and I still think about it every time I drive that stretch of desert after midnight. Back then, I worked as an overnight courier driving samples and equipment between hospitals. I covered a lot of ground across Arizona, sometimes hitting Flagstaff, Phoenix, Kingman, even Las Vegas if the route called for it. The money was good, and the solitude didn't bother me. Most of my deliveries were time-sensitive, so I was used to driving at odd hours with nothing but desert scrub and long-haul trucks around me. That night, I was heading north on Route 93, somewhere between Wickenburg and Wickiup. If you know that stretch, you know how empty it gets after dark. One lane in each direction. No shoulder. Just blacktop cactus and the occasional pair of headlights cutting through the hills. It was about 1:40 in the morning. I remember glancing at the clock because my ETA to the Kingman drop site had just adjusted. The sky was clear. The radio was off. I'd passed one truck maybe 10 miles back and hadn't seen another vehicle since. That's when I saw her. She was just standing in the middle of the road. No car, no flashlight, no phone light, nothing. Just a pale figure facing my headlights, feet planted square in the center of the lane. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a cow, something I'd need to swerve around. But as I slowed, I saw her clearly. She looked like a woman in her 30s, maybe younger. Long dark hair, jeans, a light jacket. No bag, no shoes. Her hands were loose at her sides. She wasn't waving or panicking. just standing there, completely still. I braked hard and came to a full stop about 20 feet away. I flicked the high beams to get a better look, and she didn't flinch, didn't even squint. She just stared straight ahead, not moving. I rolled down the window a crack and called out, asking if she needed help, if she was okay. Still nothing. I couldn't go around her easily. The road was too narrow, and I didn't want to risk catching gravel or hitting a pole. So I stayed put and called 911. The dispatcher was calm, asked for my location, asked if the woman was injured or distressed. I said no, she wasn't doing anything, just standing there. I asked if maybe there'd been an accident, if she'd been reported missing. The dispatcher told me to stay in the vehicle and that a sheriff's deputy was already in the area. Shouldn't be more than 15 minutes. About 8 minutes later, a cruiser pulled up behind me. I stepped out and waved the deputy forward, but he didn't rush. He just looked past me at the road ahead and said, "There's no one there." I turned around. She was gone. I walked up the road, even scanned the desert on either side with my phone flashlight. Nothing. No footprints. No sound. Just the highway stretching ahead in both directions, dry and silent. The deputy asked if I was sure she hadn't stepped off into the brush, but I told him I would have seen it. There's nowhere to hide out there. Just flat sand and scattered rock. If she'd walked away, I would have seen her silhouette retreating under that moonlight. He didn't press it, just nodded. Slowly said, "People sometimes get disoriented out there and vanish quick. Heat-cold exhaustion. It messes with your perception, even at night." He asked if I'd like an escort for the rest of the drive, but I said no. I was too confused to feel scared just yet. I got back in the car and started driving again. But about 10 miles up, I saw something in the road again. This time off to the right near one of those little emergency call boxes they used to install every couple of miles. Just a figure faint in my peripheral vision. I didn't stop. I kept driving. When I looked in the rearview mirror, there was nothing there. I made my delivery around 3 a.m., signed the forms and headed back the same way, telling myself the whole thing was just a trick of the light. Maybe it was a mirage, maybe some local outwalking. But deep down, I knew better. Here's the part that still unnerves me. A couple of days later, I stopped at a diner just outside Wickenburg and got to chatting with a guy sitting at the counter. He was a local contractor, said he'd worked all over that corridor for years. I told him about what I saw, kept it vague, just said I'd seen a woman on the road around mile marker 179, and she vanished. He put his fork down and said, "Was she barefoot?" I nodded slowly. He said folks out there call her the Mile 179 lady. Said she started showing up a few years ago. Always the same. No shoes, no voice, standing still until someone stops. Then she disappears. Some say she was a hitchhiker who got picked up and never made it home. Others say she ran out of gas one night and froze to death before help arrived. A few insist there's a cross out there somewhere with her name on it, but no one can ever find it when they go looking. I asked if he'd seen her himself. He said no. But he'd heard enough stories from truckers and night drivers to stop using that stretch after sundown. I still take that route sometimes. It's quicker, and work is work. But I never stop at 179. I don't even slow down. And if I ever see someone in the road again, I don't think I'll call it in. Because if she wanted help, she would have asked. But she didn't. She just stood there, still as the rocks, watching. I used to help a small-town real estate office upstate, mostly handling quiet foreclosures and seasonal evaluations for old mountain properties. It wasn't glamorous work, but it gave me excuses to drive into rural Pennsylvania, where the roads narrowed into gravel and some houses hadn't seen electricity in decades. In 2014, I was asked to take photos and update the value of a property on Hollow Creek Road. The place had been listed for years, but never sold, and no one in the office seemed to know why. I figured it was just too isolated. But I remember that visit more clearly than almost anything else from that year, and I haven't taken another job like it since. The house sat at the very end of a shaded cul-de-sac tucked deep behind rows of tall evergreens. It wasn't falling apart exactly, but it had the look of something the world had slowly pulled away from shutters, sagging on one side, mail piling up in a rusted box, and a porch that creaked before you even stepped on it. My clipboard had the name Bernice Caldwell listed as the owner of record, but it also mentioned she'd moved out 5 years earlier. I assumed the place would be empty. Most houses like that are. But when I pulled into the drive, I saw movement behind one of the side windows, a figure stepping slowly back from the curtain. I paused before getting out of the car. I hadn't been told anyone still lived there. After a few moments, the screen door opened, and a woman came out onto the porch. She looked to be in her 70s, thin and pale, wearing a long wool cardigan, even though the air was warm. Her hair was neatly pinned up, and she moved like someone who didn't expect company, but wasn't surprised to have it either. I introduced myself, explained I was with the appraisal firm, and she nodded like she'd heard it all before. "It's fine," she said, gesturing toward the steps. "You can come in." I was expecting someone soon. I wasn't sure what she meant by that, but I didn't ask. Inside, the house smelled like lavender powder and something less pleasant underneath, like damp wood or earth that hadn't dried properly. The living room was dim despite the daylight outside. Heavy curtains kept the windows half closed, and a single lamp glowed orange in the far corner, though I didn't hear a generator or any signs of modern power. A small table near the hallway held a plate with 2 slices of pound cake untouched and 2 teacups turned neatly upside down. Mrs. Caldwell didn't offer a tour, but she followed me from room to room, never speaking unless I asked a question. Each space was eerily preserved furniture, draped with crocheted cloths, old magazines, stacked with neat precision, a black and white TV with knobs that looked unused for decades. In the upstairs hall, I noticed that all the bedroom doors were closed except for one. I asked if that had been her room. "No," she said. "That's the one they used. She didn't answer, just stared into the dim doorway until I moved on. After finishing my checklist, I thanked her for the time and asked if she planned to stay much longer. Her expression changed then. Not angry, but confused, like she'd only just remembered something important. "I wasn't going to," she said. But then the house wasn't empty anymore. I didn't know what to say to that. I chalked it up to age, maybe memory lapses, maybe some confusion about whether or not she'd truly moved out. It happens. I wrapped things up, stepped outside, and wrote down a few final notes in the car before I left. When I glanced up at the house again, I saw the upstairs curtain shift just slightly, as if someone had leaned away from the window. That might have been nothing. But 2 days later, I stopped by the township clerk's office to drop off paperwork, and I mentioned that I'd seen Mrs. Caldwell. The woman at the counter gave me a strange look. "She passed away last November," she said. "You sure it was her I was?" I described her clearly, the cardigan, the hair, the way she spoke. The clerk just nodded slowly and said, "That's Bernice, all right," but she didn't elaborate. I drove back out to Hollow Creek Road a week later, mostly to convince myself it had just been a mistake. Maybe a relative was staying there. Maybe the records were wrong. But the gate was chained. The porch was covered in leaves, and a red notice had been stapled to the door, unfit for occupancy due to structural damage. No one answered when I knocked, and no lights were on inside. That was the last time I visited a house alone, without double-checking the occupancy list. I still don't know who or what I spoke to that day. But the thing I think about most isn't her face or her voice. It's the way the other teacup had been freshly turned, as if someone had just used it, or was about to. I've thought a lot about these stories and what ties them together, even when the locations, faces, and years are different. They're all about moments that don't behave the way we expect them to. A routine patrol on a winter road, a hotel hallway that loops wrong, a knock at the door with no one there. These aren't grand events. They're interruptions, tiny malfunctions in the rhythm of the everyday. And maybe that's what makes them so hard to forget. Because for the people who lived them, they weren't dramatic or violent. They were quiet, specific, personal. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't what you see, it's what you remember seeing long after it's over. The shadow that doesn't feel like a trick of the light. The gesture that made sense only after you left. The way the house felt like it was listening. I think everyone carries a few moments like that. Most of us don't talk about them. We file them away under tiredness, imagination, coincidence. But now and then when we're alone, driving, cleaning, listening to the wind, they come back. And for a second you wonder if maybe you didn't imagine it after all. So if something you've heard tonight lingers with you longer than it should, maybe that's just your mind playing tricks. Or maybe like me, you've been carrying something all this time. Something that never asked to be explained. Thank you for staying with me until the end. I hope these stories kept you company tonight, or at least kept you from turning the lights off too quickly. If you'd like to hear more stories like these, feel free to follow the channel. Share it with someone who'd understand and subscribe for the next quiet night. And tell me, has there ever been a moment where you felt something watching? Even though you were alone, I'd like to hear about it if you're willing to share. Good night.